"Ma'am, you're banned from flying." The words hit her like a slap in front of 200 strangers. What none of them knew, what she could never explain, was the call sign she once carried into combat. Minutes later, one radio call from an F-22 would change everything. Stay till the end. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The departure board at Denver International Airport blinked with the ordinary chaos of a Tuesday morning: delays, gate changes, the low roar of 10,000 footsteps moving in every direction at once. Somewhere in that river of travelers stood a woman named Elena Cross, 40 years old, dressed in a gray hoodie and worn sneakers, a single duffel bag slung over one shoulder. She looked like nobody. That was, in fact, the whole point. She had learned, over the last 2 years, how to disappear inside a crowd. How to keep her shoulders relaxed and her eyes down, how to let people's gaze slide right past her without landing. It was a skill that had taken her a long time to build, because for the first 38 years of her life, disappearing had never once been necessary. People had noticed Elena Cross. People had saluted her. She reached the counter at gate C-14 and handed over her boarding pass and ID with the same practiced calm she used every time, a calm that caused her more than anyone watching could have guessed. The gate agent, a young man with a name tag that read Derek, scanned the pass without looking up. The machine beeped. Then it beeped again, sharper this time, a different tone entirely. Derek's easy customer service smile flickered and died. He looked at his screen, then at Elena, then back at his screen, his fingers suddenly quick and nervous on the keyboard. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment." "Is there a problem?" Elena asked, though she already knew. She always knew. "Your name is showing a federal flight restriction," Derek said, pitching his voice low, though not low enough. A businessman in line behind her went very still, phone halfway to his ear. A mother tightened her grip on her son's hand. "I have to call my supervisor." Elena nodded once and stepped to the side, setting her duffel down at her feet, folding her hands in front of her, standing the way she had once stood for inspection, spine straight, chin level, eyes forward. It was a posture that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with survival. If she let her shoulders drop even an inch, if she let the humiliation show on her face for even a second, the crowd would smell it, and crowds were merciless with blood in the water. Word moved through the gate area the way it always did, not in shouted accusations, but in whispers, in sideways glances, in phones quietly angled in her direction. What did she do? Is she dangerous? Should we be worried? A father steered his daughter toward a seat on the far side of the gate, putting 3 empty rows of chairs between his family and the flagged woman standing so unnervingly calm beside the counter. The supervisor arrived within 4 minutes, a stocky man named Paul Ferris, badge clipped to his belt, radio crackling at his hip. He didn't introduce himself. He simply looked at his tablet, looked at Elena, and said, "Ma'am, you're on a federal no-fly list. I can't let you board this aircraft." "I have an approved exemption," Elena said quietly, and reached into the front pocket of her duffel for a folded manila envelope, worn soft at the creases from being carried and re-carried through a dozen previous flights that never happened. Inside were 3 letters, one from a Federal Review office, one from a lawyer whose retainer had eaten most of her savings, and one, the thinnest of the 3, from a hospice in Sacramento informing her that her younger brother had perhaps 2 weeks left. Ferris studied the paperwork with the flat suspicion of a man who had seen forged documents before and assumed, by default, that everyone lied. He made 2 phone calls, tapped through 3 screens, kept Elena standing at the counter for 22 minutes while the rest of Gate C-14 boarded around her, students and grandparents and a Little League team in matching jerseys all filing past the woman being treated like a threat. Finally, grudgingly, he handed the papers back. "You're cleared. Last to board. Back row. You'll be under crew observation for the duration of the flight, and if there's so much as one incident, we divert and you're arrested on landing." "Understood?" "Understood," Elena said, and meant it, because none of that mattered next to the fact that she might still make it to her brother in time. She boarded last, walked the aisle under the eyes of 140 strangers, and took her seat in 31E, beside the lavatory, exactly where the system had decided a banned woman belonged. A flight attendant named Priya positioned herself 2 rows up with her arms crossed, watching her the way you'd watch a stove burner you weren't sure you'd turned off. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, because the record had been sealed under 3 different classification stamps, was that the woman in seat 31E had once held the call sign Ghost Hawk, and that for 9 years she had flown missions that most of the people now avoiding eye contact with her would never be cleared to hear about even in outline. Elena Cross had joined the Air Force at 22 with a physics degree and a stubborn streak her instructors alternately loved and hated. She earned her wings 2 years later, near the top of her class, and by 28 was one of the few pilots in her wing certified for high-risk reconnaissance and escort work, missions that didn't appear on any public roster. Her call sign came from a training exercise early in her career, when she'd slipped an entire opposing squadron's radar net so cleanly that the debrief officer swore she'd flown through solid air. Like a ghost, he'd said. Like a hawk that never shows up on scope until it's already got you. The name stuck, and over the following years it came to mean something specific among the small community of pilots cleared to fly alongside her: absolute precision, absolute calm, and an uncanny instinct for finding the one option nobody else could see. 2 years before the morning at Gate C-14, Ghost Hawk had been flying escort on a classified extraction over contested airspace when the mission profile fell apart in real time. The asset they were protecting on the ground was compromised. The extraction window was closing. And the order coming down from a command post 6,000 miles away, filtered through satellite delay and officers who had never once flown the terrain they were staring at on a screen, was to abort and let the ground team fend for themselves until a second, safer window could be arranged. Elena had made a different call. She'd broken formation, run a corridor no one had authorized, and bought the ground team the 11 minutes they needed to get out alive. Every person on that mission came home. Every one of them. It should have ended there. It should have ended with commendations. Instead, it ended with a closed-door investigation that lasted 4 months, because her decision had also exposed, in the process, that the original abort order had been based on faulty intelligence pushed through by an officer with a career to protect. Rather than admit the intelligence had been wrong, the official record was quietly rewritten: Captain Cross had disobeyed a direct order and endangered the mission. The heroism was buried. The insubordination charge was not. She was offered a choice: contest it and watch the classified mission details spill into a public court-martial that would burn several careers, including some far more senior than hers, or accept early separation with an administrative flag that would never explain itself to anyone, least of all her. She chose silence. She always would have chosen silence, that was who she was, but silence had a cost, and the cost was a name that now triggered federal databases every time she tried to board a plane, and a story no one was permitted to hear. Flight 88 pushed back from the gate 19 minutes late and climbed out over the Rockies into a clean blue sky. Elena closed her eyes, tried to rest, tried not to count the hours until she'd see her brother, tried not to think about Priya's watchful presence 2 rows up. 40 minutes into the flight, cruising at 39,000 feet somewhere over the Utah desert, the cabin changed. It was subtle at first, the kind of change that most passengers wouldn't register consciously, only feel as a low hum of wrongness they couldn't name. Elena registered it instantly. A shift in engine pitch, faint but real. The overhead lighting flickering once, twice. A flight attendant near the front moving with the particular urgency of someone whose training had just kicked in. Then the intercom crackled, and a woman's voice, not the captain's, came through, thin with barely restrained panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Reyes. We are declaring an emergency. Captain Alvarez has lost consciousness and I am having difficulty maintaining." The transmission cut out mid-sentence. The cabin erupted. A child began crying. A man 3 rows ahead of Elena stood halfway out of his seat before his wife pulled him back down. Priya's calm evaporated in real time. She grabbed the handset at the forward galley, her knuckles white, trying to raise the cockpit and getting nothing but static and a single garbled word that might have been, "Help." Elena was already moving. She came up the aisle fast but controlled, the same controlled speed she'd once used walking across a flight line toward a jet with an engine fire, and reached Priya at the forward galley before the woman had even fully processed what was happening. "I need you to listen to me," Elena said, and something in her voice, flat, steady, utterly without panic, cut through the noise around them like a blade. "I'm a pilot. Multi-engine, high-performance aircraft, thousands of hours. If both flight crew are down, this airplane needs someone in that cockpit in the next few minutes or everyone on it is going to die. I know I'm the woman you were told to watch. I need you to trust me anyway." Priya stared at her, at the flagged passenger, the one she'd been briefed to keep an eye on, the one half the cabin had spent the last hour treating like a criminal, and for one terrible second the old training won out, the instinct that said never trust the restricted passenger, never open that door on a claim alone. "I can't just," she started. "Call it in," Elena said. "Raise dispatch, raise ATC, tell them you have a passenger named Elena Cross requesting cockpit access, and ask them to check military flight records. My call sign was Ghost Hawk. They'll know what that means faster than you'd believe." Something about the specificity of it, the fact that a woman in a gray hoodie in seat 31E was speaking in exact numbers and exact procedure, broke through Priya's hesitation. She grabbed the handset and relayed the message word for word to Denver Center, her voice shaking but her hands finally steady. 200 miles north, at Hill Air Force Base in Utah, an alert klaxon had already gone off 11 minutes earlier, the moment Flight 88's transponder squawked its emergency code. 2 F-22 Raptors from the 34th Fighter Squadron were scrambled within minutes, screaming off the runway and climbing hard to intercept the stricken airliner and provide visual assessment, standard protocol for any commercial aircraft in extremis over U.S. airspace. Lead pilot was Major Dale, Renegade Okafor, 9 years in the Raptor, calm under pressure in the specific way that only comes from having already survived the worst days of a career. His wingman, First Lieutenant Maravas, flew tight formation off his right wing as they closed the distance to Flight 88's position, sensors already locking onto the airliner's transponder and relaying a live picture back to Denver Center. "Renegade, be advised," the controller's voice came through, "we have a passenger aboard requesting cockpit access. Name is Elena Cross. She's flagged in the FAA restricted database but is claiming prior military flight experience, call sign Ghost Hawk. Need you to confirm whether that name means anything on your end before we authorize." There was a pause on the frequency. A pause just slightly too long to be nothing. "Say that call sign again," Okafor said, and something in his voice had changed, the professional flatness cracked just slightly, replaced by something closer to disbelief. "Ghost Hawk," the controller repeated. "Elena Cross." Okafor keyed his mic to his wingman on a separate channel before responding to the controller. "Voss, you hearing this?" "Copy, lead," Voss answered, and her voice carried the same edge. She had come up through flight school on stories about Ghost Hawk. An instructor who'd flown 2 rotations alongside her had told the story of the extraction over contested airspace so many times it had become half legend among the younger pilots, the kind of story that got told at bars and never appeared in any official history, because officially it had never happened the way everyone knew it happened. Okafor keyed back to the controller. "Denver Center, this is Renegade. If that's really who's on that aircraft, she is cleared for full cockpit authority, no further verification required from this end. Tell the crew to give her whatever she asks for and get out of her way. I flew with people who flew with her. If Ghost Hawk is offering to fly that airplane just got the best pilot within 1,000 miles. The transmission went out over the emergency frequency, which meant it reached not only Denver Center but the cockpit relay being monitored aboard Flight 88, and Priya, standing frozen at the reinforced cockpit door with the handset pressed to her ear, heard every word of it. She turned to look at Elena with an expression that had gone, in the space of 10 seconds, from suspicion to something close to awe. "Ghost Hawk," she whispered. They said your name like they knew you. Open the door, Elena said quietly. We don't have time for this. Priya entered the emergency code and hauled open the heavy cockpit door. Inside, Captain Alvarez was slumped forward against his harness, unresponsive, skin gray. First Officer Reyes was semi-conscious in the right seat, one hand still weakly gripping the yoke, her breathing shallow and rapid, the unmistakable signature of hypoxia, oxygen starvation working through the bloodstream like a slow poison. Get them on portable oxygen, now, Elena said to Priya, already sliding into the vacated left seat, hands finding switches and dials with the automatic fluency of muscle memory that 2 years on the ground hadn't managed to erode. She snapped on her own oxygen mask first, clearing her head in 3 sharp breaths, then forced the cabin pressurization system into manual override, watching the cabin altitude reading begin, slowly, to fall back towards something survivable. She keyed the radio. Denver Center, this is Flight 88. Elena Cross, in command. Both flight crew incapacitated from hypoxia due to a pressurization fault, now on supplemental oxygen and stabilizing. I have manual control of pressurization and I am flying the aircraft. Requesting vectors back to the nearest suitable airport and emergency medical standing by. Copy, Flight 88, the controller answered, an unmistakable note of relief cutting through his professional calm. Vectors to Salt Lake City, runway 16 right, emergency services are already rolling. Renegade flight will escort. Copy that, Elena said. Appreciate the company. Okafor's voice came back a moment later, this time patched directly to her. Ghost Hawk, this is Renegade. Good to have you back in the air. We'll fly your wing all the way down. You call it, we'll match it. Behind her, through the open cockpit door, Elena could hear the murmur of the cabin shifting, the fear giving way to something else as word spread backward through 140 passengers, seat by seat, row by row, the band woman is flying the plane. The fighter jets know her. They called her something. What did they call her? The descent into Salt Lake City took 18 minutes, and Elena flew every second of it with the precise, unhurried economy of someone who had landed far less forgiving aircraft under far worse conditions. Reyes recovered enough oxygen saturation partway through the descent to sit up, disoriented but present, watching the woman in the left seat with an expression of dawning recognition. You're the one they said was restricted, Reyes managed, voice still thin. Boarding said you were flagged. Dangerous. I was flagged, Elena said, eyes on the instruments, hands steady on the controls. Doesn't mean I was dangerous. Sometimes those aren't the same thing. The 2 Raptors held tight formation off the airliner's right wing the entire way down, a pair of silver shapes visible through the cockpit windscreen that more than a few passengers would later describe, in interviews and social posts, as the moment they understood something extraordinary was happening 39,000 feet above the Utah desert. Runway 16 right came up through a thin layer of cloud, emergency vehicles already staged along its length, lights strobing red and white in the midday sun. Elena brought the aircraft down with barely a shudder at touchdown, deployed reversers and brakes with the same unhurried precision she'd used for every part of the flight, and taxied the crippled jet clear of the runway to a stop surrounded by fire trucks and ambulances. When she finally shut down the engines and pulled off her headset, the cabin behind her erupted, not in panic this time, but in applause, in tears, in the particular sound of 140 strangers realizing all at once how close they'd come and who had pulled them back from it. Alvarez, still weak but conscious, looked at her with something between gratitude and confusion. Who are you? Someone who used to do this for a living, Elena said, and left it at that, because the rest of the answer belonged to people who weren't in that cockpit and never would be. Word moved faster than the ambulances. By the time Elena walked off the jet bridge into the Salt Lake City terminal, a small crowd of airline officials, airport security, and confused onlookers had already gathered, none quite sure whether to treat her as a hero, a liability, or both. Priya walked beside her the whole way, apologizing in fragments. I almost didn't let you in, I'm so sorry, I didn't know, until Elena finally stopped and turned to face her. You did your job, Elena said. The system that flagged me is the thing that failed, not you. What matters is that when it counted, you trusted me. That's not nothing. That took courage. Priya was still wiping her eyes when a military transport pulled up outside the terminal doors and two figures in flight suits came through security at a pace just short of a run, Major Okafor and Lieutenant Voss, still in their gear, having diverted to Salt Lake the moment they'd handed the airliner off to approach control. Okafor found her in the crowd and stopped 3 feet away, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then he came to attention and saluted, sharp and formal, in the middle of a civilian terminal full of confused travelers filming the whole thing on their phones. Captain Cross, he said. Major Dale Okafor, 34th Fighter Squadron. It's an honor. On behalf of every pilot who ever heard your name in a briefing room and wondered if the stories were true, thank you for reminding us they were. He lowered the salute, pulled out his phone, and made a call that was answered on the first ring. Sir, this is Renegade. Ghost Hawk just brought down a commercial airliner full of civilians after both pilots went hypoxic. I need you to hear that clearly. Ghost Hawk, flying restricted, saved 140 people today. I'm requesting an immediate review of her case. Whatever got her grounded, today proved it was wrong. The video was everywhere within hours, the F-22s off the wing, the smooth touchdown, Okafor's salute in the terminal. The hashtag GhostHawk trended nationally by evening. Aviation analysts called the emergency handling some of the cleanest hypoxia recovery flying they'd ever reviewed. Veterans flooded comment sections with half-remembered fragments of a story they'd heard third-hand somewhere else, always with the same shape: she saved everyone and got punished for it. 3 days later, Elena's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, area code from the Pentagon. Captain Cross, said a voice identifying itself as General Marcus Whitfield, Air Force Chief of Staff. I'm calling to inform you that, following a full review prompted by the events of Flight 88, the restriction on your record has been found to rest on findings that should never have been classified as they were. Effective immediately, your flight status is fully restored, along with your rank and record. We are also prepared to offer reinstatement, should you want it, or full clearance for any civil aviation role you prefer instead. Elena sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment before she trusted her voice enough to answer. Why now, she finally said. Why after 2 years of silence? The general didn't dodge the question. Because you did something 200 people watched happen, and no one could pretend it away this time, he said. There were people in this building who knew what really happened on that extraction 2 years ago, Captain, and disagreed with what was done to you. We were overruled by people protecting their own record instead of yours. I'm not going to pretend that's a satisfying answer. It's just the true one. 2 weeks later, Elena stood on a runway at Hill Air Force Base in dress uniform for the first time in 2 years, flanked by Okafor, Voss, and a dozen other pilots who'd flown in once word got out that Ghost Hawk's wings were being formally restored. A group of young pilots waited near the edge of the ceremony, and after the formalities ended they approached her the way people approach someone they'd only half believed was real. We grew up hearing your call sign in briefings, one of them said. When we heard you'd been grounded, it felt like they were trying to erase you. But you came back anyway. Elena thought about Gate C-14, about the 22 minutes at that counter, about Seat 31E and Priya's crossed arms 2 rows up, how close it had all come to ending there, quietly, one more grounded name in a database nobody would ever question. I didn't come back because I proved anything to anyone. She looked up at the clear afternoon sky, where a pair of Raptors were already climbing out on a training run, contrails cutting bright lines against the blue. It was the sky she'd been kept out of for 2 years by a mistake no one had wanted to admit. It was the sky that, in the end, had called her back the moment it actually needed her. Ghost Hawk was flying again. And this time, no flag in any system was going to be enough to ground her. In the weeks that followed, the story took on a life Elena hadn't anticipated and, honestly, hadn't wanted. News vans idled outside her apartment building for the better part of a week until she finally agreed to a single short statement on the sidewalk, delivered in the same flat, economical voice she used for everything, no tears, no theatrics, just facts laid out in order, because that was the only way she knew how to speak about herself. "I did what any trained pilot would have done in that seat," she told the cameras. "The difference is that I was allowed to be there. A lot of people with the same training and the same instincts never get that chance, because a flag in a database decided for them, long before anyone checked whether the flag was fair. That's the part of this story worth paying attention to. Not me." It didn't stop the story from being about her anyway. Late-night hosts referenced the F-22 radio transmission in their monologues. A congressional aide reached out asking if she'd testify, informally, about how administrative flight restrictions were issued and reviewed, or, more precisely, how rarely they were reviewed at all once issued. She agreed, on the condition that the classified portions of her original mission stayed classified. Priya reached out too, 3 weeks after the flight, asking to meet away from cameras. She spent the first few minutes apologizing again, in a way Elena gently but firmly cut off. "You followed the training you were given. The training was built around a system that had already failed before you ever met me," Elena said. "Spend less time apologizing and more time asking harder questions the next time a flag doesn't match the person standing in front of you. That's the whole job." Priya left the airline 6 months later to join a crew training program, where she rewrote part of the onboarding module on restricted passenger protocol to include one new line: "A flag is information, not a verdict." Captain Alvarez and First Officer Reyes both recovered fully, though it took 2 months before either flew again. Elena visited them separately, not for gratitude, which she deflected every time it was offered, but because she wanted to understand exactly what had failed, the same instinct that had made her a good pilot refusing to let a mechanical failure go unexamined just because the outcome turned out fine. The investigation traced the fault to a valve replaced 18 months earlier, one that had passed inspection despite a manufacturing defect no one caught, the quiet, unglamorous kind of systemic failure that never trends online but comes within minutes of costing far more than any single villain ever could. A system built to catch it had been slow. A separate system, built to flag threats, had instead flagged the one person capable of correcting for it. Nobody had planned any of it. That was the more frightening version of the story, not malice, but ordinary carelessness stacked in just the wrong order. 6 months after Flight 88, Elena climbed back into an F-22 for a formal evaluation flight, flying wing on Major Okafor over restricted airspace in eastern Nevada. It was her first time back in a fighter cockpit in over 2 years, and in the first 90 seconds of full afterburner she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time, the pure, uncomplicated joy of flying something built entirely for capability rather than compromise. They came back down 40 minutes later, canopies up, engines ticking as they cooled, and Okafor pulled off his helmet with the grin of someone who just watched a legend prove the stories hadn't exaggerated a thing. "Still got it," he said. "Never lost it," Elena said. "Just wasn't allowed to use it for a while." "Welcome home, Ghost Hawk," he said, and this time the words carried none of the strangeness they'd had over the radio months earlier, just one pilot telling another that the sky had missed her, and wasn't letting her go again. She took the airline's training captain position a few weeks later, teaching the next generation of pilots to recognize the early signs of hypoxia and pressurization failure, the quiet emergencies that never make headlines because the crews trained to catch them do their jobs before anyone downstream has to be a hero about it. It was, she told her first class, the least glamorous job she'd ever had, and possibly the most important one. She still flew for pleasure on weekends, alone, in a small single-engine plane she kept at a regional airfield, no passengers, no flag, no system watching her. Just the quiet of open sky that had never once, in 20 years, asked her to prove she belonged in it. The ban was gone. The record was clean. But what stayed with her longest wasn't the vindication, or the ceremony, or the letters. It was the 18 seconds of silence on the radio the instant Major Okafor heard her name, the exact moment one pilot recognized another across an open channel and understood, instantly and completely, that everything had just changed. They had banned her from the sky. And when it mattered most, the sky simply refused to stay quiet about who she really was.